Are you ready to become the ultimate houseplant whisperer? If so, stick around with me and let's get into it. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So yes, for the people that have been watching the channel for a while, they all know that I've recently been to the 2025 Malvern RHS Spring Festival, and I know a lot of my audience doesn't tend to be based in the UK. And I've heard all of you, even the people that are based in the UK, not everybody could make it to the location where the event was happening, and everybody wanted to see whether or not I could actually go through the talk that I did there. And yes, this is the video for all of you. And the topic that I was talking about was plant whispering, understanding what your houseplant needs. Now, a couple of caveats here, because I know I've got a broad spectrum of viewers for my videos and my channel specifically, and I know that I've got a mixture of some beginners, some intermediate, and some advanced houseplant parents. This is a presentation that I did purely because it's the RHS and it could be anybody that's attending the event that come and see these talks. It has to talk to everybody. So it's a touch base. Hopefully that will tick the boxes for all three of those people, both the beginners, the intermediate, and the advanced. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So have you ever listened to your houseplants? And I know, before you say anything, this might sound a bit woo 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 woo, but there is some science to kind of back this up, in the sense of your plants will express things that might be going on with them, not necessarily because they have evolved in a way to tell us these things, but if we know what we are looking for, we can actually start understanding what the plants are kind of telling us. And the plants are always doing this, either through textures or colors or even posture as well. So the first thing I want to dive into, and I've got my slides down below just so I can remind myself, is yellowing, drooping, and sudden death of leaves. Starting off strong. I know this is something that stresses out a lot of people. And let's go down the list. Firstly, how about the leaf yellowing of some of the oldest leaves, usually at the very bottom of a plant. So for instance, if this is the plant in question, this is a propagation of a Epipremnum skeleton key, it would be, and it's already lost most of its kind of like first leaves. So there's two stems in here. One is at the top, these are the top leaves, and it's yellowed off and basically died off are the bottom leaves. Now, what does this tell us? It's not anything you necessarily need to be worried about, because what will happen is the plants, those leaves have served their purpose. Example being the big Philodendron esmeraldense in the background, and I touched on this on a recent video. It lost some of its lowest leaves, one or two, but I've noticed over the years that around this time of the year, usually because I don't catch the watering early enough, is when it will lose those leaves. But this can happen with any of your houseplants, and it is just something that they do naturally, because essentially what this bottom leaves on this plant is saying is like, peace out, I've served my time, I've done what I need to do, I'm out of here. Same thing, I mean, the plant is essentially saying, okay, you know what? You've done what you needed to do, and if you think about how they would grow in nature, they would grow along the kind of forest floor, then they would hit a tree, and especially if they're climbing, climb upwards. Those original leaves that are down at the bottom might have been a bit smaller, a bit darker, in order to capture as much of the minimum light that they're getting down there. But in essence, what that plant is trying to do is promote as much energy to go up to the top leaves, because that is ultimately what is going towards the brighter light. So losing a couple of the oldest leaves isn't a problem. Now, you might also see flopping or drooping of the leaves. Biggest example I can give you of this is, some people might know already, the peace lily. So dramatic, flop. Just flop. Flop, 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 flop. And it's just like, I don't have any water. How have you just forgotten about me and not given me any water. So dramatic, so dramatic. But there is a reason why for a lot of people when they're first starting off, everybody says, start with a peace lily or maybe even a Fittonia. Those are very expressive plants. Again, I mentioned they're not doing this specifically for our benefit, but it's really easy to kind of pick up the signals that they're sending you, in this case, the flopping of the leaves, because on a more kind of scientific level, you can imagine those leaves are filled, that when they kind of absorb some of that moisture when you're watering them. I think the easiest example, and the one that I gave at the event was, and again, apologies for anybody who's not in the US, because I know the rest of us don't have this as much as the US, but the people in the US, hopefully you'll get this. You know those big inflatable, like, humanoid things that you get usually out, I think, outside of used car dealerships, and they flop around because there's air kind of flowing between them, and the moment that that air stops is the moment that they go. Similar thing, there is pressure with that water that is happening within the actual peace lily. Same thing with the Fittonia, the nerve plant. And when that diminishes, it kind of flops down. It's missing that internalized kind of substances keeping it upright. So that is something not to worry about. Now, sudden and more complete leaf death, so say for instance, I'll give this example again, if all of the leaves, or the majority maybe with the exception of one, all yellow off and die, sadly that usually means that you need to be looking out for more nefarious things. So potentially it might be pests you might have not have noticed, and there's like the pests have decimated the plant or they've weakened it enough that it's kind of dying off. It might be that, and this is really extreme, you don't tend to get this quite as often with underwatering unless you have literally forgotten a plant for months on end and never watered it. But usually a lot of the times it could also be root rot. So essentially you've loved the plant a bit too much and it's all a bit too wet and you've rotted out all of your roots and it's starting from scratch. At that point, consider your plant, especially if it's lost all of its roots, consider it a propagation and you're starting from zero. But how about noticing other things with the leaves? So things like curling of the leaves, things like blistering of the leaves, or even sweating. So let's pick this up one at a time. So the first one would be something like curling of the leaves. And let me see if I can bring up an example. I don't think I've got any that are curling at the moment, shocking, because I'm pretty sure everything has been watered. No, I do have one to show you. I have literally just watered it. Doesn't my, what's it called? White Fusion look busted? Yay for killing calatheas. But calatheas are usually the best example, and you can kind of see some of the curling that's happening there. This is a different type of curling, and again, apologies for the crispiness, but you know I like to keep it real here. Can you see this leaf right here? So that level of curling that you'll get, again, a lot of the times it tends to be the prayer plants, it tends to be the calatheas, the marantas, the stramanthes, tenanthes, all of these things. That kind of really tight cigar is a new leaf. So this is a new leaf. If you start getting some of the older leaves starting to curl in on themselves, that's usually a sign of one of two things, generally speaking. One is underwatering, and imagine it that the plant is trying to protect its leaf from like losing moisture through transpiration, so it just curls in on itself to kind of like keep some of that moisture from escaping. And the other one, think of like a vampire, like being scared of the light, and it's like got a cloak and go, "Whoa, no, I do not want the light, it is burning me." If you get something like a prayer plant way too close to something like light, then it will try to protect itself, it will try to curl the leaves. And I think I had a conversation with somebody, possibly on here or on Instagram, and they were doing all the things right, and they're just like, I know, I've been watering it and all these things, and eventually, when we kind of, and there was the kind of telltale leaf curl, and eventually it was a case of, potentially it was maybe just getting it just a tiny bit too much light. So moving the plant slightly back is a nice quick way of being able to address it, and the plant has told you, it's told you, look, I'm trying to protect myself, look, I am protecting myself, and it's doing what it needs to do. Now, I've talked about sweating in plants before, and an ultimate example of this, and hopefully I'll find a picture and add it somewhere onto here, is something called guttation. And we talked about guttation before. I think I've even done a video on kind of botanical terminology. If so, I will add it up there. I cannot remember. But it's when you get, say for instance, on a leaf, and you get the very, very tip dripping down. A lot of the times, again, people that have had colocasia and alocasia know this one well. They are prime kind of candidates for doing this on a regular basis, and you'll just see a little kind of like teardrop of water or fluid dripping, dripping, dripping. I will say if you're just starting off and you're getting a colocasia, a colocasia or alocasia, caladiums can do it as well, but not as often. Make sure that you've got no electronics anywhere near the leaves of that plant, because you will get like water damage on them. Or don't put it on anything that's like untreated wood, because just listen. Don't do that to yourself. Trust me, don't do that to yourself. So this is an issue with watering. This is an issue with kind of irregularities in watering. It might be that, you know what, been watering this plant far too much. Actually, let me pick up an alocasia and show you. So my little busted Jacqueline that is coming back from the dead. This was a bulb or corm for most of winter, so it is coming back. But say it will be dripping from the very, very leaf tip, usually when it's pointing down. And it's because, for instance, with this one, I might have watered it too frequently, and it just needs to relieve some of that moisture within there so it doesn't rot out the plant. Or I've let it dry out too much, and then I just went, you know what, I'm going to be a good plant parent and just give you all of the water now. All of the water. You can have all of the water now. And all of a sudden it just goes, think of it as somebody who's like starving on a desert island. All of a sudden you give them food. They will consume all of it and then promptly throw it up, because their system isn't used to absorbing all of that food quite so suddenly. I think the edict when there's starvation involved is that you maybe start small with soups, very, very light soups, and then build up your tolerances. Think of it as the same way. It's just getting a bit too excited and having all of it, and then it just needs to release that pressure. And then you'll get something like a swelling, and I have talked about edema at length. I've even done a video, and I will add it at the top there, but hopefully I'll find the picture and add it here. That's when you get even more issues. That's when you get the blistering. Yeah, anybody who's like really into the pimple popping of it all, very, very similar. It's when you get a plant that's created like a fluid-filled kind of cyst almost within the kind of leaf structure. So it will be within the leaf, you'll get a small layer of cells that will be covering that. It'll be fluid-filled. You might not always get that. You might get smaller bumps that are happening at the bottom. These are all kind of signs of edema, and again it's to do with the irregularity of water. It might be too humid and there's no way of the water transpiring out of the leaves, and I've done an entirely separate video on kind of humidity and airflow, and it's something that people don't talk about. Airflow is really important. Again, I'll link it somewhere at the top there. But with edema, you'll get it kind of blistering out, and much like human blisters or spots and all these things, please don't pop it. Please don't pop it. Because if you pop it, at that particular moment in time, it's enclosed. There's nothing going into it. If you pop it, there's more likely that it's going to get something that could be an infection. It could be anything like that. Just keep it sealed in itself. And the other sad thing that I'm going to say, if you ever get edema, that leaf is done. So that entire section of the leaf that might have the spot, that's not coming back. That is not coming back. It will, the rest of the leaf, especially if you don't have that many leaves on your plant and it's maybe a plant that has struggled, that other part of the leaf that didn't have the edema and is still green, that can still photosynthesize. So you need to make a decision if you're very much aware of the aesthetics of your plant and you want it to look pretty. As I said, you're not getting, that leaf isn't going to revert back to its normal self. It is permanently destroyed, that section that was edema, because essentially it's cell death. They've burst. So there's no bringing them back. There's no like resurrection that's going to happen on those cells. You kind of need to be aware that if you want it to be aesthetically pleasing for you and you don't want that on there, you might need to remove the leaf. If your plant is struggling and you're not that fussed about the aesthetics of the plant and you just want it to be able to photosynthesize as much as possible, leave it on there, it will serve its purpose, and then it will go back to what we were talking about before, the older leaf death. At some point it will kind of drop off on its own, but it would have served its purpose because it can still photosynthesize on the non-blistered section. How about understanding the language of light and how that affects your plants? So it could be the moving towards the light, it could be the turning towards the light of leaves, and also the kind of understanding of what the leaf's elbow/wrist might be. So let's look at that in more detail. So usual example, the example that used at the event is something like the rubber plants, so Ficus elastica. It's really, really simple to kind of see that because that plant grows usually, unless you're getting it in tree form, it's usually a very tall up and down kind of like columnar growth, generally doesn't spread too much type of a plant. Now, if you're not giving it enough light, it will etiolate. And what that means is if the light is here, and it's just like you'll see the plants starting to lean towards the light, which makes sense. Again, think about what they're like in their natural habitat. If these things are growing in a rainforest and you're getting like dappled light, kind of think of light columns that are coming in from the canopy of the different leaves, that plant is going to try and move closer to the light to get more light if it needs it. We have talked about this before. As far as I'm aware, the only one that I can think of, I'm sure there's others, that have a slightly different tendency is a lot of the monsteras. So a lot of the monsteras, what they will do is something called scototropism. And skotadi in Greek means darkness, tropos is to kind of move towards, so it's kind of moving towards darkness. And the monsteras, over the centuries at this point, probably would have developed an evolutionary tactic which goes, okay, instead of going towards a light, let's go towards the dark. And the dark means that there's a tree, it means I can attach, and it means ultimately I can bypass everybody else that's just moving towards the light. And if I go onto a tree, I can kind of like speed my way up the tree and get closer to the light. So that's why they move towards the darkness. Not all plants will do this though, so if it's leaning towards the light, it generally means that it's not getting enough light, or enough of the light that it needs. The easiest thing, and I know a lot of people have mentioned this, is a quarter turn. So if the plant is facing the light here, every time you water it, just turn it a tiny bit, turn it a tiny bit, turn it a tiny bit, every time you water it, and eventually all of the canopy of the leaves, especially if it's kind of more upright, this is a bit of a bad example with it being like hanging down and trailing, but you know what I mean. If it's an upright type plant like this one's attached. I can't do it with this, but it's getting a lot of light this way. In a real world, if it was like, say, on something like a pole or a janky support stick, I could just move the whole thing around. Again, bad example in my conservatory because it's getting light all the way around. But say I was just in a regular household condition and there's a window, that's the singular light source, so you needed to move around, do that. The other thing is obviously leaf movement. So leaf movement, let me see if I can grab something really obvious to show you. I'm grabbing small plants because they're easy to kind of manipulate and kind of show you around. How about a Burley Marks flame, which is finally on a moss pole, yay! So what you will get is, say the light was coming from this direction, this leaf, and it's already starting to do this, this leaf will start moving towards that light. Instead of the back here where it might be dark, it will never move this way. This is a Monstera, Burley Marks flame, so this one probably might go towards the darkness because again it's trying to attach. But I'm curious, has anybody noticed if a Monstera has already attached to a moss pole, do you still see it moving away from the light? If you do, it might be not necessarily scototropism, so moving towards the darkness, but it might also be moving away from too much of a bright light. So that's the other part of the equation you need to remember. If it's turning towards the light, it means probably not getting enough. If it's moving away from the light, even a Monstera, but a Monstera specifically that's already attached, it's already done what it needs to do, then it might be getting a bit too much light. So it's trying to go, oh no, it's too much, I don't need it, I'm better here. Like here I will kind of like get a sunburn, here I will be fine. So that's what it's trying to do. And then what you'll get is that elbow or kind of wrist joint. So growing stem down here on this plant. Then you've got a petiole, which is what attaches the leaf to the growing stem, and between where the leaf meets the petiole, there's a slightly swollen section, kind of maybe okay on this one. You might see that there's a slight kind of tilt or kind of kink to that there. That's called the geniculum. And the geniculum is something that is there to move the leaf around. Not so much the petiole, not so much the growing stem, but the leaf. That is what is moving it around. So you need to make sure that if you're seeing that doing some drastic movements, it's not very quick, obviously, it takes time, but it's there to serve that purpose. Let's dive into what the roots will tell us, because they'll tell us a lot of things. First thing is maybe a bit of a tip in terms of your more kind of flowering plants. I was mentioning this at the event, we don't really grow fruit in households, generally in the UK or anywhere really. It tends to be stuff that we kind of grow outside. One of the things that I am trying, which is more on the tropical side this year, and at some point it will be living indoors, so I would want some fruit from it there. Whether or not I'm going to get it, I don't know. Is something called a pepino melon. And that I think is related to the nightshades, so similar family to potatoes, eggplants, tomatoes, all of these things. And for my British followers, I went to an American school for a few years. I find it really difficult to call it an aubergine, so I've only ever called it an eggplant. Sorry, it's what it is. But if you've got blooming plants is something that we'll have more. So think of your Hoyas, think of your hibiscuses, think of all of these different things that you want blooms for. Keep them slightly root bound. Keep the roots slightly, I'm not talking about something being extremely root bound. That's not something you want to do because that's going to stress out the plant. But just enough root bound that it stresses it enough that the plant goes, oh no, I think I'm going to die. I need to pass on my genetic information, which is what the blooms are. They're just like, look, bees, I'm here. And I'm sexually ready for you to come and pass on my genetic information to something else. So you want those roots to be slightly root bound and it will promote more blooms. I'll give you a very specific example of a plant that I've got in my care, which is one of my Hoyas, which is probably about half the height at this point of my Esmeraldense. Its pot is about this big. Not the most stable thing in the world, I'm not going to lie. But pretty much from March all the way until November time, it is filled with fully in bloom peduncles almost the entirety of that time. It is a Hoya that's like easily replaceable if it stresses it out too much that it has issues, and I can easily replace it. I wouldn't want to because it's such a cool plant. I got it to the point where it's blooming so profusely. But yeah, that's something that you might want to do. Not too much, but keep it slightly root bound. Then you move on to something that is properly root bound, where you get all of the roots going around and around and around the pot. At that point is potting up or repotting. So it's a good idea once to twice a year if you can. And again, it's not the same thing as you need to water every 7 days. No. Don't put a schedule in once or twice a year to always repot your plant. Put a schedule in or something to remind you to lift the plant out of its pot with the roots. I'm not going to do this because it's way too dry at this point. And then see what the roots are doing that often, once or twice a year. If they're really kind of like spiraling and it's more root than anything else, you probably would have noticed at that point because it means it's going to be drinking up the water so much faster. There's very little soil left. So it will dry super quickly. At that point, move up one size. So one size, usually you can get like a finger's like width all the way around, or 2 sizes. What you don't want to do is just go, oh no, I've left this for so long, it is so root bound, I'm going to give you a bucket to grow in. No. Step away from the bigger pots. What you are creating then is a moisture-filled kind of sponge that is going to be all around, not very many roots, but root-bound roots, which is already stressed, and what you're going to do is just create a perfect environment for it to just swamp itself out and create root rot. So just be careful with that. And on to the topic of root rot. This is something that you need to be checking your plants, as I was saying. Don't just leave it and say, you know, I'm not going to check for root rot, even though there's all these other signs there, you know, the sudden leaf death and all of these things that are happening. oh, I'm going to leave it because I don't need to check it now, it's in 3 months' time. No, 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 no. If you're getting your plant basically screaming at you with a sudden leaf death and a lot of the other signs that we talked about, and it's just really, really not happy, at that point you do need to lift it out, see it. If you've never experienced root rot before, the smell is going to be one of those things that you'll notice. It smells rotting, and the roots are kind of black and mush. A lot of the times they should be quite stiff, kind of white or creamy coloured. I know some plants like the pink princess will have the pinker roots. That's different, but if they are black and mush, you've got root rot. Unfortunately, mazel tov, you're going to have to deal with it basically. But it is one of those things that you're going to need to kind of chop back. And I've talked about this before, and I'll use my must emitter. Imagine that this is a root. If it's black up to about here, don't cut right here where the black ends, go a bit higher. And then also look at what you've cut. See inside the root, and if there's still a black core, keep going, keep cutting until you don't see that anymore, and maybe cut a bit more. I've had moments with some of my viewers where we're just like, I don't have any roots left. If I keep doing that, it will just be nothing. And I'm just like, yeah, yep. It's the sad truth of root rot. Sometimes you will lose all of the roots or entirety of roots and go back to an unrooted cutting at that point. And you're just basically going to have to deal with it. I would suggest that if you've got root rot, and again, this is not something that a lot of people are talking about, but as above, so below, same thing that will happen with trees. So if you get a tree with a massive big canopy at the top, it usually means it's got the same amount of roots at the bottom. Trees are plants, same in terms of concepts. So if you've lost 70 to 80% of the actual roots, you're gonna have to remove 70 to 80% of the leaves. I'm going to hold your hand and just say that this is going to be okay, but it's going to be something that you're going to need to do. Because if you don't, there are two things that are very much at high risk at that point. Not always, but very much at high risk. The plant will reject those leaves for you because it can't sustain if it's lost, or like 70 to 80% of the way that it could pull moisture in from its roots. How is it going to maintain all of that foliage on top? So it will kill them off. If the damage is significant enough and you don't do it, in the process of it killing off all of those leaves, which is still stressing it out more, it could potentially die off entirely. So bear that in mind. A lot of people that do gardening, like outside gardening, so whenever they take cuttings, and this also works if you're taking propagation cuttings, so you've got a cutting, it's not got any roots, it might have a node on it. They take off almost all of the leaves, and maybe leave one or two leaves, and even those leaves, what they'll do is, I keep using this poor plant as an example. Say I'm doing this as a cutting, I will get rid of three of its, it's got 3 leaves, I will get rid of 2 of its leaves, and actually even the leaf that will remain, what I might do is cut it in half. Because it's enough green to help it photosynthesize whilst it's building the roots, but having all of this mass of leaves that it needs to support with a root system that doesn't exist, same thing, think of it as an unrooted cutting. This is the same as a fully rotted out plant from root rot. So you're going to have to sacrifice some leaves and start from the beginning. There is no way for me to sugarcoat it, unfortunately, but these are all lessons that we learn along the way. Some of us are still making the same mistakes, so don't be too harsh on yourself. But yeah, it's something, unfortunately, that we will all go through at one point or another, and we have to learn from it. And not for me to ruin your day anymore, but let's talk about becoming a pest detective. And this, again, visually, you can easily understand the plant at this point. This is the plant whispering a bit. Again, the plant isn't telling you this, but if you know what you're looking for, it's fine. It's the same concept of, if you know how to read Spanish, for instance, and somebody hasn't specifically sent you a letter that's addressed to you, but you see a Spanish sign somewhere, it doesn't mean that you can't read it. You can still read it and understand what you need to do, even ultimately if that wasn't meant for you. Granted, sign is a bit of a weak example, but does that make sense? even though the plant isn't specifically sending you signals as a human being, you can still understand what it's saying. So yeah, the pest one is one that will stress out a lot of people, understandably, especially if you're going through it first. But again, I will hold your hand whilst I say this and say, this won't be the first, it won't be the only time. It might be your first time. But you will deal with pests. They're out in nature, they're in our houses. It's a fact that we just need to deal with within the hobby that we are in. So let's start with spider mites. So spider mites, you'll see some stippling on the leaves, so kind of like dotting that you'll see on the leaves, which is a spider mite damage. A lot of people will always assume, oh, I need to look at the webs. I always like to tell people, if you're seeing webs, it's probably quite bad already. So you've really ignored the problem or didn't notice the problem for a very long period of time, because at least in my experience, if you've got a spider mite infestation, there needs to be a lot of them, and there needs to have been there for a while for the webbing to start. So watch out for the stippling first. And then the two bugs that it's just a bit like, oh no. So, sorry, trigger warning for thrips. But yes, thrips are one of those things. They're very, very smart because they've got kind of a sharp end of their body. It's kind of like, almost think of it like an injector. And what they'll do is they'll go onto something like a leaf, and that injector on their bum, they will sit there and shove it into the leaf and release eggs that will turn into larvae and eat their way out of the leaf. Very smart evolutionary, because they're basically kind of going, let me put my babies exactly within their food source. So the moment they come out, they are surrounded by food and they can eat their way out. So you'll get those kind of silver lines that you'll get within the leaves, which is a sign of the larvae eating their way out. And it kind of looks a bit like map lines. And the other thing is you might see black dotting. And this is something called frass. What is frass, you might say? It's bug poop. It's all about poop. And that was something that, had I have known, and not a lot of people talk about this when it comes to thrips. Yes, granted, it might be soil. Just make sure that it isn't soil. It does look different. I had that on a Monstera adansonii when I was first starting quite a few years back, and it was just everywhere. And I don't understand. I couldn't see any pests. I didn't know what I was looking for. I was looking for thrips or the larvae. So all I could see was the black poop, the frass. And I entirely lost that plant. Had I have had this information earlier on, I might have been able to make that connection. The other thing that's really, really sad is, with thrips specifically, you might be able to see that emerging leaf there. They are nasty little buggers. They will go into unfurled leaves and still lay their eggs in there. So sometimes you'll get a new leaf and it's already malformed. It's because they've already got in there and they're starting to kind of eat their way out, the larva that we were talking about there as well. Something to remember with, and I've said this before, thrips are one of the flying types of pests. So just keep that in mind. They're not great flyers, so a good fan will help you a lot. Not the only thing that you need to do, but... And then mealybugs. What's I twitch in the corner because I've been dealing with my mealybugs for years. At least 2 or 3 years, I would imagine, at this point. And that should tell you something. If you're just starting off now, this entire collection, at some point or another, different plants have had different mealybug infestations. I have not lost a singular plant to mealybugs. I know mealybugs, more than anything else, give people the ick. I get that. For me, it's the thrips, adult thrips. I've got like black hair, and if you see the adult thrips, they kind of almost look like kind of thin black lines. And every time I go out into the allotment, I'll come back and kind of deal with it. I always wear hats at this point as well, because I am so like the ick and the itch. Because I'll come back and sometimes you can actually see the volume of like thrips or thunderbugs, and you'll see them if you're wearing light clothing. They're all over you, and all I can think of at that point is that they're crawling up in my hair, and I'm just like, ah. Mealybugs don't have the same effect on me. Mealybugs, I'm just like, oh, you're squishable, it's fine. But yes, if you've never seen mealybugs, they tend to be a bit more like kind of little cotton balls, almost tiny, tiny, tiny. They do move. They're very, very, very slow moving, so they almost look stationary. But a while back, I did a magnification where you could see one of the mealybugs and then you could kind of see slightly underneath them at least hundreds, if not thousands, of baby mealybugs. So it's the mama mealybug hiding them all underneath the chest. So question that came up is, what did I find is the best way to deal with them unless you're going down the predator insect route? And it is just rubbing alcohol. I will say the same thing I said at the event. When I was first starting off, I tried surgical spirit because I'm just like, oh, it's even higher percentage. I destroyed so many leaves. Rubbing alcohol, not surgical spirit. I think rubbing alcohol is 60 to 70% alcohol. Surgical spirit is 90. Do not go for something that aggressive because some leaves on some plants really will not like it. I found that rubbing alcohol generally is okay. So that's the way that you would kind of deal with that. And the other one that somebody mentioned, it wasn't part of the presentation, somebody mentioned fungus gnats or the kind of flying flies. Yes, like that is the obvious sign with that. Less so the damage at that point, you'll just see the flies buzzing around you. They look like little fruit flies, they're not. And the easiest thing, because again, the question that came up from people that were just starting off is just like, what's the best thing that I found that works? Hands down, once a year, twice a year maybe. Around this time of the year, so beginning of spring, I'll just blitz everything, water everything with nematodes. There are fungus gnat specific nematodes and I find that that obliterates everything. Obviously pulling back on watering, so they love living in kind of damp conditions, but you can't do that with certain plants like they're very, very like moisture loving. So that's not always the case, but yes, nematodes, water everything, give it a few weeks because it takes a while for the nematodes to eat the larva that is within the soil, and hopefully if you've still got some sticky traps up, it will still kill off the adults, because if the adults are still alive, they can still go wee 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 and go and put more eggs into the soil. I think the nematodes do give you some protection for a certain period of time, so even if they do put some new larva in, if there's enough nematodes there within the soil, it will still eat the new larva, but you still do need to get rid of the adults. So that's pest. I'm sorry for like triggering anybody at this time of the day. And then let's just jump back a bit to soil and the soil surface and what that tells us. So if your soil is crusty at the top, crusty, dusty, musty at the very, very top, if you are somewhere that in an area that has very, very hard water, so there's a lot of like calcium and things like that within your water. I live in a part of the UK which apparently has some of the hardest water in the UK. I tend to get this a lot. Or you overlove your plants, so you keep fertilizing them. It's just a mineral buildup at that point. It's just the plants kind of going, I'm desiccated, you're giving me too much salt. Enough. Do not do that, please. No more salt. So at that point, and I'm not one to kind of say water your plant only with rainwater because it's not available to everybody, especially people living in apartments, or get distilled water or bottled water. Please do not be introducing that much plastic into the environment just to water quite a few plants. But what you can do if it's causing you too much of an issue is maybe once every 3 to 6 months, use either distilled water or bottled water very briefly for 1 or 2 waterings just to flush out some of the minerals. That will generally help. Now, if your soil is hydrophobic, and that just means that it's scared of moisture, that's the exact translation. Idor is water, phobia is fear in Greek, so fear of water. It will kind of pull in on itself. It tends to turn into a bit of a brick in terms of the soil, and then you go to water it and it just kind of runs off. Nothing goes into the actual plant itself. At that point, the easiest thing you can do is something called bottom watering. Fill up a saucer at the bottom, fill that up with water, let it sit for like 20-30 minutes. It will absorb and kind of get rid of that hydrophobia. You might get this sometimes with some succulents, and it generally means that maybe you've let them go dry for far too long, or the soil, that's usually when the soil that came from the grower, because again, remember the growers want to do as little watering as possible. They've got other things to be dealing with, or they've got thousands of plants to be dealing with. It's not the best conditions necessarily for just yours. Replace that soil or add some new, better quality cactus or succulent specific soil, and you shouldn't have that issue. So that is hydrophobic soil. Just be aware that that happens. Now if you've got like nice and fluffy soil, that is what you want. It's a nice and springy soil. It just means that it's a healthy soil environment for that plant. If, however, you've got sticky soil, so soil that is sticky at the top here, you need to be looking at, pests might be your biggest issue there. It might be mealybugs, because mealybugs, we were talking about mealybugs before, they also have poop. Their poop is clear and sticky and it just gets stuck on everything, and ants might end up protecting the mealybugs because they like that kind of sugary like substance that they poop out. So that might potentially drop on leaves, it might potentially drop on the soil. So if you're seeing stickiness at the soil, one of the things I would say is check further up on the leaves if you've missed some bugs. Another bug that tends to do this is aphids. So you might not always see these bugs, but you'll see their poop essentially, which is that stickiness. So definitely check up the top. If you're getting like coming into kind of the more summertime for a lot of the northern hemisphere, this is a time where we get a lot of ants in and around the houses and all of these things. If you're getting a lot of ants in your soil, generally it isn't a problem. They won't cause any real problem on the soil level in small numbers. But if you're getting them a lot around the soil, start questioning why, because it might have been sticky and you haven't realized it. Now let's talk about some more advanced signals. So one would be something like leaf chlorosis. So this one doesn't have it here, but you would imagine if that's the central vein and these are the smaller veins that come off it, if I'm starting to get interveinal chlorosis, some sections here might be going yellow, but the rest of the plant is, or the leaf is green, that usually means there's a nutrient deficiency. Versus the crusty soil that we were talking about before, it's just like, you have fed me a very bland diet. Even if you've given it fertilizer, if it doesn't have some of the trace mineral elements, so that's where you see a lot of people when they get interveinal chlorosis going, have you given it CalMag? And it's calcium and magnesium as a supplement, because a lot of times that's what's missing. That is usually where the problem is solved. So anybody that tends to grow more outdoors, or citrus is one that tends to get it quite frequently, you'll understand what it is. So a lot of the times you can just get around that and not have to worry about it too much by just getting a fertilizer. You might end up paying a tiny bit more that doesn't just have the standard NPK, but it might have some of the trace mineral elements. I've talked about one of the ones that I use all the time, which is liquid gold leaf, but there are loads of others out there, and I know you can't get liquid gold leaf in all the different countries, but there are ones out there that will have trace mineral elements in there as well, and then you don't have to worry about it, which is fantastic. And then there's the thing about looking at reverted variegated leaves. And we've all talked about this ad nauseum. More light does not necessarily mean more variegation, but what it can mean is low light can mean, at least in my experience, that you can get a plant that is variegated reverting back towards green a lot faster, because what it's doing is, you know what, this whole variegated section of the leaf, that's a freeloader. I do not want that freeloader there because it's not providing any kind of nutrition to the plant through photosynthesis. So you know what, the next leaf I've got out, I want the freeloader out, or as much as possible out. So at that point, obviously, and this is more when you've got unstable variegation, make sure that you cut back down to the point of the plant that has got some variegation still. So you're kind of bringing it back to where it needs to be, and then maybe move it slightly closer to the light if it's in a very dark place, and that will help maintain some of that variegation. Don't give it too much light because it could also burn as well, but it's a fine balance, because I'm sorry, for all of us that have or like variegated plants, we know that they're not the most straightforward plants, and that is something we go into knowingly. And if you don't know that, you learn that quite fast when you get into variegated plants. And then you've got the stuck leaves. And interestingly enough, I'm looking at my Pink Princess because because you know why. It doesn't actually have a new leaf at the moment, let alone a stuck one. So, but yes, Pink Princess is one that might get that. Philodendron verrucosum can sometimes get stuck. Any kind of plant that will tend to unfurl its leaf can get stuck. So that a lot of the times has to do with the humidity in and around the plant. So bump up the humidity. That plant is telling you that it's like, look, I cannot unfurl my leaf. And there is something There's basically like plant lube that is created. I can never remember this. I think Tanya was the one that had the botanical term, and I've used it in a couple of videos, and it takes me forever to find it again. Has it gone into my head? No. But yeah, essentially the plant will create this fluid that will make kind of releasing that leaf easier. And if it's super, super dry, it can't even create that fluid. Now, what is interesting about that fluid, how many times can I say fluid? It's up there with moist. What you might get sometimes on your velvety type foliage, not this one, but more velvety type foliage, you know, sometimes you get like snail trails almost that are going down the plant, but you're just like, there's no snails and nothing's eating it. And where is that coming from? That is the remnants of that fluid that was within that plant ready for it to unfurl. It's usually not problematic. You can clean it off if you really want. If it stays on there, it's not going to cause any real issues. Obviously, do keep an eye to see that it isn't an actual slug, but it should be fine. But yes, your unfurled leaves is kind of telling you, you know what, I need a bit more moisture, please. Or if it's in a very humid environment, but you've got a lot of airflow and maybe too much, that humidity isn't going to be there for long enough to get any real benefit. It's still drying out because of the airflow. So it's a fine balancing act. In summary though, like, plant whispering isn't magic, it's just observation. So a lot of the times you just need to remember three things: watch, wait, and adjust. So watch out for some of the signals that we were just talking about there. Wait to see if it kind of continues, and if it does, adjust in whatever way you need to in order for it to kind of improve the situation, dealing with pests, dealing with watering issues, dealing with all of these things. That will be how you would address it. And obviously I would add another kind of wait and then assess at the end as well, because you've done something, wait for it to have some effect. Please wait for things to have some effect. I cannot tell you how many people, like a lot of times that I talk to, it's just like, but I've done all of the things, and I'm just like, okay, when did you do the things? 2 days ago. Plants don't move that fast. Give it a few weeks, maybe a few months, depending on what the situation is or how bad the damage might be, in order for it to be able to bounce back. But yes, that was the presentation that was done in Malvern. As I said, talks about a whole different host of things. And I know some of this might be kind of things that we've discussed on the channel before, but did some of these surprise you? Anything you want to add that I've probably missed out? Probably missed out quite a few things. But yes, do let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.